Dan the Hangman Hooker is back. The revival of a lifetime is upon us. We've seen these careers pop up throughout the history of MMA, where a guy seems to be down in the dumps, been on a long losing fight streak, had a rough couple of years, many losses, many poor performances, many just lackluster overall showcases of their skills. Dan the Hangman Hooker is back and better than ever. Platinum hair Dan, tatted up Dan, alpha crazy, chaotic Dan is the new mythical fighter. We got tatted up Dan Hooker, the Hangman himself, the Slim Reaper, coming back for his vengeance. Might I take you back just a couple of years? The heyday of Dan Hooker, the slugger, the brawler, one of the top contenders at lightweight, put on a run like no other. Great fights back to back to back to back. Here we go. Let's back it up to when he beat welterweight contender Gilbert Burns. Mark Giacchese, a solid fighter. We'll skip Ross Pearson, but Jim Miller also in there, and lost via body kick to Edson Barboza in an absolute war, which he came forward on the feet. An absolutely exceptional performance, even in a loss. Fun fight, great fight. Next up, James Vick. We all remember James Vick. Never one to shy away from a fight. Ally Quinta, the blood and guts war that they went to in their fight. The Ally Quinta that you know is not a very entertaining fighter. Dan Hooker brought him into a war. Paul Felder. We all know how that went. Absolute barn-burner, slugfest of a matchup. Beautiful fight. Great heart displayed by both fighters. You love to see it, right? After the fight with Paul Felder, he went on to one of the greatest fights of all time. Arguably one of the greatest stand-up fight-only fights in the UFC in the past 5 years. One of the first fights at the Apex in the small cage. Him and Dustin Poirier, this Dan Hooker guy, this Dustin Poirier, the Diamond, that guy versus Dan Hooker, the Hangman. These guys went all out, back and forth, put everything on each other, elbows, knees, everything. Straight punches, hooks, every possible strike you could imagine, right into the crevices of the face. They beat the absolute living nightmare out of each other. Dustin Poirier came out on top in a devastating loss for Dan Hooker. He then took on Michael Chandler, newcomer to the UFC. Many who do not know who Michael Chandler was at the time were expecting Michael Chandler to make some kind of splash because we knew he was a big mouth, we knew he had power, but we didn't know that he was going to finish Dan Hooker in the way he did. He put Dan Hooker out in one round, one punch, shut him out, put the lights out. He was down on the floor, face down, ass up. It was humiliating. He then took on Nasrat Haqparast after a long layoff at the Volkanovski-Ortega card. Got the win, unanimous decision, wasn't anything to write home about, not super impressive, but a guy lower in the rankings, kind of his comeback fight after taking 2 losses, we understand. He then took on Islam Makhachev on short notice. He was subbed in the first round, yes. Another loss, it's okay, we'll get there. We'll come to the revival part of this. Islam Makhachev is a monster. We now know what he is. Arnold Allen has proven that he is a top contender at featherweight. How bad do these losses really look in hindsight? Dustin Poirier, top-ranked guy. Michael Chandler, top-ranked guy. Heavy-handed guy. Islam Makhachev, absolute killer, maybe the greatest fighter we've ever seen. And Arnold Allen, absolute murderer at featherweight. Will only lose to the top 5 guys. He then took on Claudio Puelles, who has really, really good jiu-jitsu. Dan Hooker is a striker. That's not a good matchup for Dan. Claudio even got a hold of him in moments, made it a little bit iffy, a little bit scary here and there. But Dan Hooker came out on top. Body kick TKO in the second round. Here we start on the revival. Good, solid win just outside the ranking. Then he went to an absolute war with Jalen Turner, the younger man, the guy that most of us were thinking, Dan, he's taken a couple of bad losses. He might be washed up at this point. Hard to say what's going to happen in this fight. Dan Hooker pulled it off, man. Jalen Turner and Dan Hooker, the Hangman, took advantage, snatched him up, got it done. split decision victory. I would argue unanimous decision victory. And finally, we come to Mateusz Gamrot, his hardest fight that he has had in the past 5 or so years. One of the best technical grapplers in the lightweight division as we now stand is Mateusz Gamrot. Dan Hooker beat this guy up on the feet, survived on the ground, beat him up on the feet, survived the ground, beat him up on the feet. What else could you ask from this guy? This guy's an absolute stud, an absolute legend. It's time for Dan Hooker to be taking on Justin Gaethje next. Justin Gaethje's been through too many wars, as he says it himself. Dan Hooker has taken the time off necessary to recover from some of these wars that he has had. He's the younger, hungrier guy. He may not seem like he's young because he's been around for so long, but he's still a pretty young guy. He hasn't taken the beatings against the higher level of opponents that Justin Gaethje has. Maybe it's Dan Hooker's time. Let's get this guy in a big-time matchup. Whether it's Fiziev, Gaethje, Chandler rematch, I'd even like to see. See what he can do. Dan Hooker's coming, baby. This guy's coming hard. And he wants to win, and he's going to make a name for himself, and he's going to have fun fights because, baby, he loves this. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. I'll see you next time.